This is our Peacemaker Circle format, and we really try to mix up our guests and our topics and kind of work our way around the perimeter of our interest areas and our areas of action and activity. And so today, I am utterly delighted to have Pico Iyer as our guest. And we've just had 15 minutes in the green room, so to speak, chatting, and it was so much fun. We very likely crossed paths in Santa Barbara in the 70s, where Pico grew up. And I had his dad in university in 1974, which is just a really improbable coincidence here. So this should be a fun hour and a half, and I wish we had 3 hours today. That would be so much fun. Pico's here primarily to talk about his latest book, AFLAME, which I finished over the weekend, and I will highly, highly, highly recommend it to you. And he's going to tell you more what it's about. I believe Pico has 15 books in print, perhaps something like that, in 24 languages. And I've been reading him since 1988. And Pico's one of my favorite authors. And I will try to embarrass him by putting him up in the same pantheon as Peter Matheson and Graham Greene and Joan Didion and Jim Harrison and so many of the other people that fill that shelf behind me, that I've read all of their work as well. So, and I was thinking of something earlier today, and we're going to talk a little bit about fires and evacuation and stuff. Our power went out this morning, and I was all packed up to evacuate, to go down to a coffee shop to do this in a coffee shop.
Mm-hmm.
But it came back up just in time. But during that time, I was thinking about, I lost my thought. I'll come back to that. At any rate, this is why they call it getting older. So anyway, let's enjoy that. So I'm going to hand. I know what it was. It was actually really personal for Pico. And if you haven't read his words, if you do a Wikipedia search, you're gonna see travel writer.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how Pico feels about that. I don't describe Pico's writing as travel writing. It certainly is about far-flung places around the globe, but it's anything and everything but and as it comes to writing. But the thing that occurred to me this morning while I was scraping ice off my car outside was that it's like having a conversation. And it's just really personal, and you can hear Pico's voice so clearly. And it's like your friend is sitting there telling you stories. So if you've not had this experience, please do. I started with Video Night in Kathmandu in 1988, read The Lady and the Monk. I read his Cuba book and the last three and assorted others in between. And there's so much there for you to choose from. So enough from me. Pico, I'm going to hand this to you and let you do with it what you will, and then we'll have a little dialogue. And everybody here is going to be welcome to ask questions or make comments too. So make notes if you'd like to. Pico, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Geoff. I'd say the more questions, the better, and the fewer answers, the better, probably. But thank you for such generous words, Geoff. As you were saying, when we've never met before, and as we began talking 10 minutes before meeting all of you, we realized we need 6 hours at least. But thank you for embarrassing me and delighting me. And of course, I'm so happy and honored to be with all of you. And I'm also a little bit embarrassed. I'm sitting here in snowy Pittsburgh. Temperature tonight will be -20 with the wind chill. But that apart, I'm embarrassed to be talking to you because I think all of you know much more about some of the things we'll be discussing than I do. My most recent book is about silence and retreat. As Geoff said, I don't really think of my work very much as travel, though the first 3 books involved a lot of different countries. You could say it's about transport, but I think it's about inquiry, and it's about just looking around the corner. In fact, my last book was called The Half-Known Life, and I would say it was about the first 2 tenets of the Zen peacemakers community. In other words, not knowing. The older I get, the more I see I don't have a clue. And the second was about bearing witness. And I remembered when I was growing up, I was the first member of this fortunate community to which all of us belong, whereby we can actually go to Tibet and Iran and North Korea and Bolivia. And so I've tried to travel a lot just to see the reality beyond our screens and what we never will hear from the media, and just the human reality that we share across the continents. So I don't want to say very much now, because really I'm looking forward to that conversation with Geoff and with all of you. But I thought maybe I would just begin with 2 small readings from my new book called AFLAME. And it's essentially about my first 100 retreats with a group of Benedictine monks in a remote, radiant wilderness in Big Sur, California, high above the Pacific Ocean. And the fact that these monks are so open-hearted that they take me in, even though I'm not a Christian, and take in probably the majority of their retreatants are Buddhists or Sufi or... and also, I think they speak for the principles that Zen peacemakers celebrate, because they're so deeply in their Catholic tradition that they're basically open to everything else. The recent prior used to teach at the Tassajara Zen Center across the hills. When I went to have dinner with him in his cell, he had on his wall a picture of Jesus in the lotus position. When you check into your little cell there and you open the pamphlet, on the first page it says, well, of course, the father of monasticism was the Buddha, and it cites the Rig Veda. And also, they actually maintain a Catholic Hindu ashram in India, where the priest wears a dhoti and he sleeps on the floor and eats with his hands. And the motto under which they live in that ashram is, "We are here to awaken from the illusion of separateness." And I think a lot of my life, a lot of my travel, and certainly my retreats are about first trying to awaken, because I sleepwalk through my life. And secondly, it's particularly awakening from the illusion of separateness. And as our world and our nation gets more and more divided, trying to come to those human or silent places where we have much more in common than apart. So I love the fact that they're trying full time to awaken from the illusion of separateness. And then I loved it even more when I found that beautiful phrase actually comes from Thich Nhat Hanh. And I thought, good for the Catholics to be taking as their talisman the words of a Vietnamese Buddhist. So I'm just going to read 2 very tiny sections about things that you know far better than I do, and then Geoff and I get to speak. And I'm happy to be doing this because except for recording the audio version, I've never read from this book before. So this is a first, very likely a last. So again, this part you certainly know, but for those who don't, I write at the beginning of my book, the silence of a monastery is not like that of a deep forest or a mountaintop. It's active and thrumming, almost palpable. And part of its beauty, what deepens and extends it, is that it belongs to all of us. Every now and then I hear a car door slam or movement in the communal kitchen, and I'm reminded thrillingly that this place isn't outside the world, but hidden at its very heart. In the solitude of my cell, I often feel closer to the people I care for than when they're in the same room, reminded in the sharpest way of why I love them. In silence, all the unmet strangers across the property come to feel like friends, joined at the root. When we pass one another on the road, we say very little, but it's all we don't say that we share. And I think maybe the key phrase in what I just read is hidden at its very heart. You know, I think a lot of people who've never been on retreat or never meditated think it's stepping away from the world. But to me, it's stepping deeper into reality, right into the heart of some part of ourselves and some truth that we've mislaid along the way. You know, T.S. Eliot wrote about how, where is the life we have lost in living? And I think the more the world accelerates and the more we're racing from supermarket to grocery store to bank, the more we misplace something fundamental without which we can't really function. And so one reason I've gone on retreat so often, and it's probably part of the reason you're part of this community, is to recover that deeper self and non-self that puts everything in perspective and reminds me that I'm just a drop in the ocean and part of something much larger and wonderfully much more enduring than I will ever be. And the other little section I'll read, which is harder to read, again, I read because it's about maybe a community and a geography not so far from where some of you are sitting. We all want to dissolve, the old Zen monk in red bobble cap and thin glasses tells me, with a wry chuckle, as he greets me in the chill mountains behind Los Angeles, 300 miles south of Big Sur, where I've come at the end of December. We all need the experience of forgetting who we are. I think that's what love is, forgetting who you are. He flashes a crooked grin. Forgetting who you are is such a delicious experience, and so frightening. Bells toll through the dark, and I hear the sound of clappers. The stooped figure leads me up an unlit path between the trees to the meditation hall. The smell of incense everywhere as 30 students dressed in black take their seats in rows on either side of a central altar. Not a cough or tremor. When they break, they hasten out into the night and walk in single file between tall pines on the icy ground. Upon their return, to the sound of a pounding drum, they recite the Heart Sutra at lightning speed, its syllables in Japanese a fusillade of sounds. For 7 days and 7 nights, they'll mostly be sitting in this hall, stepping out occasionally for visits to an outhouse and meals taken swiftly and in silence, mopping the leftovers with tea. In his small cabin, all friends are welcome, says the mat outside. My gracious host, twice the age of most of his comrades, assures me there's nothing special about this training. This cluster of cabins in the high, dark mountains behind LA used to be a Boy Scout camp, though now, in his modern telling, it's a penal colony. Every word and action in the emptiness decisive as a slash of calligraphy across blank pages. Towards the end of the next day, my guide to Zen practice leads me up again through great shafts of light between the conifers. The air vibrates with the intensity of silence. We step into the room where the head of the community, a tiny 88-year-old Japanese man in heavy layered robes, is sipping something strong. I came to America to die, the abbot announces. I arrived when I was young, 55. I was fit as a jumping shrimp. He's never bothered to learn much English. Words are needless scratches on the clarity of what lies beyond. I look at the monk who's brought me here. I think of myself at 17 in a little hotel in Bombay, listening over and over to his songs about Marianne and Suzanne, the one who told you when he came he was a stranger. Always in command, on point. And now, on this dark mountain, he carries himself like an anonymous grunt, scrubbing floors, cooking for the abbot, driving the old man to the doctor. He has no interest in holy men or golden sentences, he says. He knows how to play that game a little himself. This is simply the most helpful, the most imaginative response to the predicament of life that he has found. Here you find answers, I suggest to Leonard Cohen shortly before I leave. Here you find freedom from answers, he replies in the grave and gravelly baritone beloved by many. Freedom from questions, a landscape without doubt. The songs, I realize as I drive down from his mountain, are often about suffering, panic and jealousy and pain. He never pretends he isn't defeated by love and himself and all the ways in which he isn't what he hopes to be. But they're never simply sad. They speak for a struggle in which words like happiness and sadness are beside the point. The only thing you can believe in, he keeps telling us, is a reality you can't comprehend. So maybe with that little introduction to Mount Baldy Zen Center, it would be a good place to step aside from the book and engage with Geoff and maybe talk about fire.
Talk about fire, yes. And for everyone else, you got a little taste there, but one of the delightful things about Pico's book is he brings his friends along with him, and Leonard Cohen is one of those friends, but he also brings Henry David Thoreau and Thomas Merton and Graham Greene, and Henry Miller was probably my most favorite compatriot of yours that you brought along in this book. Yeah, we were chatting earlier, and we've got some shared experience, contemplative practice, of course, one of those, but fire is the other one. And the title of this book is so apt because it is, and I don't want to try to explain, but it is partly about literal fires, and Santa Barbara has had some epic fires, and Pico's family lost their house, I believe, in 1990 to the Painted Cave fire, and then fires in Big Sur are notorious and famous in a horrible way. But it's also about this fire in here, is what I feel. But I wanted to ask you, Pico, about reconciling these two things. Where I live now is in the forest. We're up above 7,000 feet on 5 acres, and it's dry. It's really it's dry even today, even though we got a foot of snow. It's bone dry out there, and we've evacuated a dozen times. And I keep, as I mentioned to you earlier, I keep a bag with everything I need to go in 1 minute's notice, right behind me here on the floor. And that I mentioned, I used the word earlier when I was talking with you, that somatic dissonance perhaps between the anxiety or the fear or the alertness or the unguardedness that one needs to have in fire country, juxtaposed or blended with silence and stillness, I think is a really rich thing to ask you about. How do you feel? How do you experience that?
Yes, well, we know in the Californian hills that landscape needs fire for regeneration. Fire is a kind of Easter force, replenishing, clearing out the outgrowth, and bringing things back into the world. So given that we can't live without fire, as you say, the question is, how do we live with fire? We also know in the hills of California that we're living where probably we were never meant to live. We're trespassers. And as you say, we lost everything in the world in one fire. Like you, we've had to evacuate 12 times since from the rebuilt house. And I think much of the world is living with this question, whether it's fire or flood or tsunami or hurricane or typhoon, the larger question of how do we remain calm in the face of uncertainty, and how do we keep up hope in the midst of impermanence, the classic Buddhist question. And for a long time, actually, I wanted on the cover of this book a picture of one of the statues of the Buddha encircled by flames, sitting absolutely calm and unmoved, because, of course, the Buddha said all life is a burning house. Don't waste time. There's a real urgency to it. We don't know what's happening tomorrow, so give ourselves fully to this moment. Thomas Merton, his Catholic counterpart, always said the world is burning, burning, burning. And yet, as you say, even as the external flames are rewriting our lives, we can't afford to let the inner flames of hope and confidence and conviction subside. And so sadly, when I gave the book this title, Aflame, I sensed it would be much too topical in much too many places, much too often. Tragic that it came out just as flames were upending so many lives in Los Angeles, and now I think there's more fires in San Diego, but that's the condition in which we live. I don't mention in this book, but of course I'm haunted by a book many of you will know, Fire Monks, about the fires that regularly encircle Tassajara, and the question that faces all the Zen students there: to what extent should we let it go? To what extent should we just surrender to this reality and not be attached to the material stuff of our devotion? Because what I learned quickly the night of my fire was I lost everything I owned in the world, but not everything was lost. I still had my mother, still had my wife to be, I still had the songs that play in my head. And one thing that surprises me now is that I was stuck in the middle of that fire for 3 hours. I almost lost my life. And when finally I was able to drive down, I went to an all-night supermarket and I bought a toothbrush. That was the only thing I had in the world. And then I went to a friend's house to sleep on the floor. But before I went to sleep, I asked if I could use my friend's computer, because my job in those days was to be a columnist for Time magazine. And so I wrote the back page essays, and I just had eyewitness view of what was then the worst fire in Californian history. So I wrote an account of the day that had just passed. And I ended it with a poem that I'd picked up in Japan because I'd already begun spending time there, from the 17th century. I think it's well known now, but maybe it was a little less so in 1990, in which the poet says, "My house burnt down. I can now see better the rising moon." And so I think part of contemplative practice is to see that no event is good or bad, and no loss comes without liberation. And it's very hard to make sense of events until many years later, if you can even do so then. And so even the night of the fire, having lost everything in the world, I sensed that this was opening doors as much as closing them. And my heart really goes out to all the people who have had their lives so violently unsettled in Los Angeles. But my hope is that as the months and years pass, they're going to find that new avenues open up, maybe, for all the ones that seem to have closed behind them. And so one small anecdote I include in the book, but I think it speaks for just what Geoff was saying. In other words, the condition in which we're all living is that there was one moment when we had to run away from our rebuilt house because there are fires all around it again. And at the very same moment, there were fires encircling my friends in Big Sur. And I was staying in the same friend's house where I stayed after our house burnt down. And when I woke up in the mornings, I didn't know whether to look up into the hills where our house was meant to be and see there was nothing there, or not to look up. So I thought, where am I going to find solace? And then I remembered there was another monastery high up in the mountains right in Santa Barbara, 15 minutes away. So I drove up to that monastery and I stepped into its sunlit, silent garden. I just sat there and I took a deep breath, and I could see the DC-10s flying over town to try and control the fire. And I could see the haze on one side and the beautiful blue ocean on the other. And really, it was all the medicine I needed. It was very restorative. And I drove back down 15 minutes back to the place where I was sleeping, very restored. And then that same year, the place I'd gone for refuge burnt down. So there were no guarantees in life, and nowhere sits outside the laws of reality, impermanence, and change. And how do we keep strong in the midst of that? So I thought that was an important question to pose post-pandemic at a time of climate crisis, and when I think many of us are more aware of uncertainty than we were before. And that awareness of uncertainty is not a terrible thing, because I think Buddhist practice suggests we always have to keep that awareness, and that's what actually moves us to bring full attention to right now, which is the only certainty we have.
Yeah.
And there's probably much more we could say about fire.
Yeah. And you mentioned one of my childhood heroes, Thomas Merton, and ironically, not literally fire, but he died from electrocution. So one could say, yeah.
Yes, and then exactly. And then I think one of the passages that's the most powerful in Thomas Merton is the fire watch, which is maybe his version of the Buddha's fire sermon. But there he is on July the 3rd, I think it's 1951, at the end of his book, The Sign of Jonas. And he's walking with a flashlight and a key round his darkened monastery, because his job that night is to make sure there's not a spark or ember anywhere in the monastery, because it's so fragile and it could burn down at any moment. But even as he's walking from room to room to protect his fellow monks, he is aware that he can't let the fires within him subside. And there was one moving moment. As I say, my monk friends in Big Sur are always having to evacuate. And I'll say just two more things. The first is that not long ago, a huge fire broke out on the property right next to theirs. Nearly all the monks raced out, but 3 of them stayed behind with the firefighters to try to protect their home. And the prior would send out updates every morning to concerned friends like myself. And one morning he said, "There's smoke everywhere, and I can just see the first tongues of orange rising up over the ridge behind us, 200 yards away. But don't worry, we are maintaining our offices. We're practicing vigils and vespers and matins. Blessed day all. Blessed day all," he said. On the same day, it looked as if he might lose his life and might lose everything that he loved in the world. And so that degree of confidence that comes to some degree from his faith, but from also his practice and something beyond his faith, is really moving, and is probably what most of us need as we try to navigate our lives. How do we find the confidence to say blessed day all when it looks as if we're about to lose everything we have? And for those who haven't figured it out already, the title AFLAME partly comes from actually one of the stories of the old Desert Fathers that Thomas Merton recounts, of a young monk. It sounds like a Zen parable. A young monk who comes to an elder and he says, "I read all the scriptures, I try to do good deeds, I try to empty myself out, I try to do everything possible. What more can I do?" And the older monk turns to him and says, "If you so wish, you can be a flame." Which I suppose is the mystic's conviction, that you can be on fire yourself forever.
But as you describe your friend's reaction to the fire, what I'm really hearing is surrender or trust that no matter what, I remember one of the passages you were talking with him, I believe, as you were driving back up the road, probably cringing because of the precipitous nature of the road. But I won't remember the quote exactly, but it was something like, it's over when it's good, or something like
Yes. Yes, I mean, maybe this is the sign of his being a Christian, but he believes in happy endings. And so he says, if it's not happy, it's not the end. There's more to come.
That's right. That's it.
And
Yeah.
whether or not you believe in happy endings, there's always more to come. I mean, that's almost what I sensed the night of the fire. Oh, I've been reduced to ground zero. I have nothing in the world, but this is not the end of the story. I'm still alive. I can still respond to circumstance, and who knows what tomorrow is going to bring. And tomorrow, over the course of years, brought many wonderful things that were as surprising as the startling thing the fire was. And I was just going to say, I'm like you, Geoff. I've forgotten my thought, but it will certainly come back to me.
We'll have a chance. And I'm sure you've heard of, in our Zen koan curriculum, we have a koan that concludes with kind of, in the face of circumstances that are otherwise, the teacher, the monk, the master replies, "Every day is a good day. Every day is a good day."
That is actually the calligraphy from a Zen master we have up on our tiny little room in Japan.
Oh, no kidding.
Good reminder, because yes, I think we went to see him after somebody we cared about died, and he said, "Remember that, and remember that 1,000 things are happening every day, and many of them good and many of them not so good." And I think, it's a simple phrase, but one of the things that's always helped me soon after I arrived in Japan was to hear this maxim that life is about joyful participation in a world of sorrows, speaking to that Buddhist truth that suffering is part of the nature of life, in the sense that most of us, if we're lucky, grow old. Nearly all of us get sick, and every single one of us will die, but none of that is incompatible with wonder, beauty, and joy. And in fact, it's probably the reason why we need to find wonder, beauty, and joy when we can. And again, as with my Benedictine friends, I I often think of the Dalai Lama. I've been lucky enough to spend 50 years talking and traveling with him, and I really feel he has suffered more than anybody I've met in my life. He's lost 13 of his siblings. He's referred to as a demon in monk's robes by the government of almost the largest nation on earth. He's had to live 65 years in exile. And yet, as you know, all he does is radiate joyful confidence, that infectious laugh, that constant smile. And so monastics, I found, are a very powerful reminder of how, as they say, joy is the happiness that doesn't depend on circumstance. It's easy to to be happy when you're on a golden beach on a sunny day with not a care in the world, but they radiate this joy even when their lives are so difficult at every moment, and it's very moving and inspiring to witness that.
And it's not denial, is it? And it's not painting the world with a happy paintbrush. It's fully embracing, what it is that's happening.
Exactly. Embracing reality and not expecting reality to conform to our needs or wishes, and not expecting reality to be anything other than it is. And somebody was just asking me yesterday, she was very interested, a writer from the Sudan, who was a great admirer of the Dalai Lama, but hadn't had the chance to hear him in person. She said, tell me about the Dalai Lama. And I said, well, if there's one word I would use to summarize him, it's realist. Because he's been leader of his people since the age of 4, he's never been in a position to engage in romantic abstractions or wishy-washy thinking. His life is fully in the world, and even as it's fully in the world, it's always radiating hope and that sense of possibility. I think, thinking yesterday, the Dalai Lama is really possibility incarnate. I think, again, if I were to summarize the message that he's bringing to the entire world, Buddhists and otherwise, it would be possibility, and that each of us has the chance to be something other and more than we imagine. And that's a beautiful thing to hear from somebody who is in such very, very difficult circumstances.
Wonderful, wonderful, yes.
And that's right, and good. I finally remembered. As you say, I knew it would come back of its own calling. Nothing I could do to make it come back. But surrender, I mean, beautiful, Geoff, because that's exactly what it was. And I think that's one of the reasons why that I was trying to get at in that section about Leonard Cohen, because anyone who knows him knows that in his early years, he's all about making his own destiny. He says goodbye to every woman in his life because he has to follow his spiritual path. He calls himself Field Commander Cohen. He calls his backup group the Army. There is a man with a very powerful sense of will and destiny. And then he gets into trouble. He starts meditating with Sasaki Roshi. And suddenly he's offering this song, which I think is his greatest song, and he thought was his greatest song, If It Be Your Will. I mean, this classic prayer. And it doesn't matter who the you is, whether he's referring to his teacher or to the God of the Old Testament or the universe. But if it be your will, I will be silent. I am spoken for. A complete surrender to the universe. And I think, in my experience, many of us come to that as the years go on. I mean, certainly when I called my last book The Half-Known World, it was partly because when I was in my 20s, I thought I knew it all. I'm on top of the world. I'm a master of the universe. And of course, the older I get, the more I see I can only be a servant of the universe. I'm on the bottom of the world. I don't know what's happening this afternoon. And that's the place where I have to live and find my delight, and can find my delight, I think.
That's wonderful. Thank you for that. Let's take a bit of a turn here, and maybe so we can give context to our group of friends here who are listening. You've spent time, obviously, in Zen monasteries, in the Zen setting, and of course, 100+ visits to, and I want to pronounce this Camaldoli,
maybe, yes, New Camaldoli.
Camaldoli, okay. New Camaldoli Hermitage and Big Sur with the Benedictines. And I'd be interested, and hopefully others would be as well, to kind of hear a contrast between these two. Somewhere in your book, you referred to the much more structured or rigid aspect of the Zen experience. But and then as you talk about your time at Camaldoli, it seems much more unstructured and kind of self-designed how you spend your time. So I'll be interested in that.
Thank you, Geoff. That's really an essential question. Yes, and I was just going to say self-directed, self-designed. So every retreat I've been on there is entirely unstructured. The monks just make available their space, a beautiful room with a private walled garden above the Pacific Ocean, 900 acres of extraordinary landscape, 1,200 feet above the sea, and there are no rules and no expectations. They have 5 services a day, and if you want to seek out spiritual counsel, you can from them. But otherwise, they have the broad-mindedness and wisdom just to leave everybody in silence and feel that whoever you are and whatever your background, whatever your religion or lack of religion, you will find what you need in silence. And so there's no human really at the center of this community. There's no theology. They're just saying, welcome to this place, free of some of the distractions of the world. And this is probably where you will recover something that you lose when you're driving along the freeway. And of course, like many monks, they speak of recollection. And I've realized that's about 2 things. It's partly remembering and retrieving something you intuited and knew, but as I say, lost sight of. And secondly, recollection to me now means taking the scattered parts of my being and bringing them into a whole so I'm fully present, which sadly I'm not, because when I'm driving along the 101 freeway, I have 1,000 things on my mind, most of them trivial. I'm dominated by an email that came in 6 seconds ago and thinking about the conversation with the bank manager 6 minutes from now. And I'm in the equivalent of a canyon of skyscrapers rather than a vast open meadow. And they're making available the vast open meadow of an inner landscape where you can find whatever you need. And I think I've come to trust silence more because, as I say, I've never seen the world as divided as it is now. And I feel it's divided by our beliefs and ideas. And silence is the place on the far side of those. And that's why if all of us start talking, although we share so many similar assumptions, I think at some point we're going to be divided. But if we're silent, and I think this is what you experience in the Zendo when you're all meditating together, we're brought together in our deepest place where there are no divisions. We're in the world beyond the illusion of separateness. And I think that's what most of us are craving in our life. In a world of increasing despair, I think we're looking for hope and light, which is what I find in silence. And in a world of dividedness, we're looking for union. And I think that's why if you lose somebody and you're marking that occasion in a church or in a field, you'll often invite the body of people to share a moment of silence. And you can feel that people are in their deepest self when they're in that moment of silence, precisely because I think of words as the froth on the cover, on the top of an ocean. And it's deeper down in the ocean that we are really united. And I think for me, it sounds wishy-washy, but every time I step into that silence, which is not just an absence of noise, but is this presence created by years of meditation and prayer, and I found it in every convent and monastery in every order across the globe. Every time I step there, it's as if little Pico and all his tiny thoughts and plans and expectations is left down on the highway, and I'm released to something much larger. And I'm reminded I'm absolutely tiny, and I'm out of my head and back in the world, back in my senses, and not at the mercy of my constant chatter and the monkey mind and whatever, and simply encircled by the light on the ocean and the sound of the birds and the bees buzzing around the lavender. What liberation! It's liberation from the self. You know, Christopher Isherwood, you all know this because you practice meditation. Christopher Isherwood wonderfully said, well, the ego is like that man who insists on standing in front of you in the horse race, you know, the man who stops you from seeing everything. And so every time I step into the silence, it's as if the lens cap has come off. And that lens cap is probably my idea of myself or the Pico Iyer I'm carrying around in the world. And I'm released into some larger reality. So I'm guessing everything I'm saying is very similar to what you all have encountered in your own often Zen experience, but there it's enjoyed in silence, and solitude. But what you realize in the solitude is that solitude is only a gateway to a deeper sense of community and compassion. Now, one thing I should say, especially because this is the Zen peacemakers community, and I know of your deep commitment to being in the world, bearing witness to the world, and bringing meditation into action, which is the only point of meditation, I suspect. The Dalai Lama often says that he thinks that Tibetans, because they've lived in isolation behind the highest mountains on earth, undisturbed by the world for many centuries, have actually advanced quite far when it comes to meditation. And he thinks maybe we have some advantage when it comes to meditation. But he feels that the Christian groups are really good when it comes to tending to the suffering, going out to Africa, to the middle of war zones, helping people along the streets who don't have housing or food. When it comes to social justice, he tells his Tibetan monks, please learn from your Christian brothers and sisters. So I'm so glad what Zen Peacemakers is all about, which is taking the fruits of your clarity into the world where it's most needed. And I've always thought that the particular blessing of this Dalai Lama is, of course, he's never been able to spend most of his life in meditation or sequestered in a monastery or on top of a mountain. He's right there on Fifth Avenue and in the European Parliament and the White House, like an emergency room physician dealing with people in real need. So I suppose that is the other thing I notice about the Catholic monks, which is certainly true in your Zen community, but just their strong sense that these guys are part of the Camaldoli's congregation, which is a 1,000-year-old order that's the most contemplative within the Catholic Church. So they're much more prone to meditation than most Catholic orders, but they know that the meditation is only a means to the greater end of having something to bring out to those who visit and to those who are in suffering.
Very nice, thank you. And I was planning to ask you, and not as a gotcha question, but I was planning to ask you, what do you feel like you've gotten from this practice? But I think you just answered that question. I think you answered it in a very rich way.
I could say more if you wanted.
Maybe you could say more, but let me append another aspect to that too. When you leave New Camaldoli, and you drive back down Highway 1, and you're back in Santa Barbara, and the phone's ringing and all that, does some of that come with you? And what is that? What is that experience? What does it feel like?
Thank you, Geoff. The reason I'm laughing is that's exactly what I was going to say. So that's a perfect question, and that was going to be the beginning of my answer to what I gained from it, because but 2 days after I leave the Hermitage, I'm cursing at the next driver in the rush hour traffic, and I'm fretting about my tax return, and I'm worried about why my editors are asking me to rewrite that article yet again. So I'm sort of back in that same agitated, extremely unexalted state in which I live. If I stay there for 3 days, I find that for about a day and a half, I'm living above the clouds, and then I come down to earth. But I sometimes, even when I'm living above the clouds, the jolt of leaving that exalted state and seeing paradise, the gates of paradise, fade behind me, sometimes makes me more impatient or more jangled than I might be otherwise. So, as everybody knows with meditation, it's not as if it's an instant cure, or it doesn't sometimes seem to resolve anything. But I think cumulatively, over 33 years and 100 retreats in just this one place, as well as many other retreats, in my case, it's really made a difference. I think one of the differences was it quickly reoriented my values, and I realized that there was a fork in the road, and success as I'd conceived of it as a little boy lay in one direction and joy lay in the other. And I realized, well, joy was the only one to choose. And so it freed me from some of my ambitions and my wish to make a name for myself in the world and advance in terms of my resume and freed me to go and live in a 2-room apartment in the middle of nowhere, Japan, paying $500 a month rent with my wife and formerly our 2 kids. But also it just reminded me, wherever I am, I take the memory and the possibility of that forgotten self and of that silence and of that liberation with me. So as I'm walking through the streets of Pittsburgh today, I know what I'm seeing and feeling is not the whole of the story. And I know that there's some deeper part of myself and some beyond that puts all of this in perspective and makes it seem very trifling. I remember when my father died, and it was a very busy time because I was looking after my mother, and I'm an only child, and there were 1,000 things to do. I realized the only way to come to terms with that form of impermanence was to drive 3.5 hours up the coast and just sit above the ocean with the bells tolling in the distance and the birds singing around me for 2 hours. And somehow being with those things that aren't permanent, because everything is impermanent, but are more permanent than I am, made the fact of impermanence and death much less scary and alarming than it might be otherwise. It just reminded me, insofar as I'm a drop in the ocean, as is my father and my mother and my wife, the ocean's going to continue for a long, long time, and I don't have to be quite so fretful as I might be otherwise. So I think it's changed me in all kinds of ways. And of course, as with probably everybody who's here today, I try in my daily life to incorporate little practices to open that clearing and to visit that large open meadow inside myself, however busy my life might be. And so that's a big change. And I've been thinking a lot about the 10,000 hour rule, whether you're practicing music or playing basketball. Half the days you do it, it's going to be frustrating. But in the long term, something has been created inside you, which is really the only thing you have to bring to the ICU and your inner savings account, which is essentially the only savings account that matters.
Thank you. Wonderful. Wonderful.
I mean, Geoff, you've been in this practice 50 years, and I'm sure there's agitation, frustration, challenge in every moment of it. And yet you're not just a radically different person 50 years on than when you joined CCLA, but you're aware that you have resources that maybe you wouldn't have developed so much otherwise.
A teacher friend of mine refers to this as like getting wet in the fog. You don't notice it when it's happening. And my metaphor for it has been, walking backwards into a darkened room. It's not something that you can muscle your way forward into. It's a letting rather than a doing. I don't know if that's your experience of this.
I'm going to steal that. I mean, that's remarkable and beautiful, walking backwards into a darkened room. So there's some sense of light always there, or that dark isn't the whole of the story or the end of the story necessarily.
Yeah.
I love that. Thank you.
With my own practice, I've run away more times than I can count. What's the most difficulty you've had, or have you had difficulty with, have you ever driven the 3 hours up the coast, gotten there and going, gosh, I just want to be back in Santa Barbara and having a hamburger?
Yes, thank you. I've never driven there and wished I was in Santa Barbara having a hamburger, much though I love In-N-Out, which is my daily sustenance. But I have been there when, torrential winter storms have broken out. The rain beats down on the roof through the night, and the wind shakes the flimsy foundations of this little wooden trailer. And I look out, and it's absolute nothingness. I can't see a single light or sign of human habitation. And I know just to get a carton of milk, I'm going to have to weather the storm. And it's terrifying and lonely. It's that 40 days in the wilderness. It feels like 40 days in the wilderness, even if it's only 8 hours in the wilderness. And it's good for me to be reminded, as people know from meditation, that it's not love, peace, and understanding. Much of the time you're walking into the storm, you're walking sometimes forwards into the darkened room, and that when you're alone in a cell, your shadows come out, your demons jump out at you. When the Buddha was meditating under the Bodhi tree, Mara appeared, and when Jesus went into the desert, Satan appeared, and they're as much a part of the picture as the Buddha nature is. So that's all very tonic. And Thomas Merton says, if you go to into contemplation in search of anything, you're going to be disappointed. No guarantees, and much of what you find may be what you least want to discover, but you have to do that. And so I've had those moments of disquietude there, but what it's really done is increase my respect for the monks who are living on intimate terms head on with that challenge for the rest of their lives. No compromise, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. They're in their cells. And I think much of the time they're surrounded by doubt, fear, and frustration. And some of them joined the monastery because they felt a strong connection to God. And when they arrive, God disappears, as with Mother Teresa, for years on end. And there they are, with themselves in the wilderness, having pledged to stay there for the duration. And that's what requires real courage. It's not so hard for me to stay there for 8 hours, but they're staying there for 60 years with nothing to support them, sometimes other than a kind community. And as you know in the book, I've grown very close to many of these monks because they've been there for 33 years, as I have. And they'll come down to my trailer and they'll share their fears and their terrors with me and their frustrations with the order and with the community. And I was very touched that in this case, when I completed the book, I sent it to 2 of the monks I'd written about because I didn't want to presume on their anonymity. I didn't want to get things wrong or to betray things that are very private. And both of them got back to me the next day and said I shouldn't change anything. But one of them is the one who shares so many of his apprehensions and his discomfort in the community with me. And so I thought he might not want me to include that. And he said, please include that because our brokenness is what we have to offer to the world. It's the fact we're mortal and human and fallible and scared and don't know what's coming next. That is our contribution. That fact we're not above the clouds and we don't know it all. And just like your practice of not knowing, that's what these monks are embracing. And I was very touched that he would see his brokenness as his blessing in some ways.
Beautiful, beautiful. I want to make sure that we have some time for others who I'm sure will have some questions or comments. But beforehand, and I really sincerely do not want to be presumptuous in doing this, but I'm so enjoying our connection. We're connecting over silence. We're connecting over fire. We're connecting now over double combo, like a hamburger and a burger, which I find delightful. But I wrote a prayer. I wrote a prayer to fire a couple of years ago. That if you would indulge me, I'd love to give it to you as a gift. And it's relatively short. It's called Fire, Please. Fire, please pass me by. Please pass by the ferns, the spruce and pines, the cactus, grasses, and wildflowers, the bears and lions, deer and foxes, turkeys and rabbits, jays, squirrels, spiders, snakes, and unseens. Fire, please pass us by. Pass by my friend Joan and her community in Santa Fe. Please pass by Diana, Tanya, and Sean and Taos. Please pass by the earliest Pueblo residents and the Spanish descendants near Mora, who have walked lightly on the land hundreds of years, and the spirits of the Arapaho people who hunted this canyon 1,000 years before. Fire, please pass me by, or maybe give us a little more time. The rains could come as they do, you know. The breeze just now is cool and soft. We've made ready for you. Our bags are always packed. We know you are stronger, but we can move out of your way. We bow with respect and we chant words of protection for all beings. And you said that perhaps we should not be here. Fire, please pass me by. You have been here with us before. I remember so well. If you must come close, please save me a little distance. I promise to put palms together and look straight at you as a man on your land. Fire, please pass me by. So that's for you.
So moving. Thank you, Geoff. And actually listening to that, it made me think, and you mentioned in your prayer, Indigenous peoples across the world. In my last book, I wrote a lot about the Indigenous people of Australia, who, of course, I think made their peace with fire a long time ago and knew they would actually set fires in order to cleanse the land and knowing that that was part of the cycle of nature. But I think I can imagine some wise Indigenous person writing exactly that prayer and knowing that we can never be stronger than fire, but hoping that fire will listen to our petition.
Yeah,
Thank you.
to our plea, to our plea.
Yes, yes.
So let's do this, Pico, if you're comfortable. Anyone who's got a question or a comment or an observation or something to share, and if we can keep them relatively brief, that would be nice. But down under, I'm sure you all know this, down under React, you'll find your electronic hand. And if you want to click your electronic hand, we'll watch for you, Chloe. If you can help me keep an eye out for folks, we have a couple of screens. Bill, thank you, Bill.
Thank you. Thanks for that poem, Geoff. That was wonderful. I wanted to, of course, thank Pico for being here. I listened just yesterday to the podcast Fresh Air that you did with Terry Gross, and I want everyone to know about that because that was just a wonderful, description of all that we've been talking about today. But if for everyone interested, I'd love for you to hear that too. And I'm so happy that we get to meet on a more intimate level, which sounds funny on a Zoom call, but it is amazing how the relationships that we are able to do this with. And I'm from the Zen Center of Denver. Bill is my name, and I just thought it was kind of funny because our temple and our Sangha is the lotus in the flame Sangha, which of course comes from this. We often hear the metaphor of the lotus blooming in the mud, but there's also the image of the lotus blooming in the flame. And so I've always loved that metaphor. And I just wanted to share that with everyone. And very grateful for being here. And thank you so much, Pico. You have been an inspiration to me from early on in my Zen practice. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Bill. I really appreciate that. And I'm really happy you mentioned Zoom because it's a perfect example of one of the blessings of the pandemic. The pandemic brought so much grief and sorrow to so many people, and yet it too opened so many doors. And 6 years ago, we wouldn't have entertained the thought that we could all meet like this and talk in this relatively intimate setting. And it's again, I always worry about myself. I take for granted the many, many ways that the world is advancing and fixate on the many ways it's not working so well. And I always feel that's a very inappropriate response to everything. And I remember even during the pandemic, it allowed me to see and do so many things I wouldn't do otherwise that I was much the richer for, including taking a walk up the road, on which a lot behind the road, the house where my mother has lived for 50 years. And I'd never done that. In all those 50 years, I'd never walked 20 minutes to the end of the road till the pandemic forced it. And suddenly I saw the road where my mother is living is as beautiful as anywhere I'd travel across the world to see. And Zoom is another wonderful thing that we got out of that difficult time. So, but thank you for your kind words.
Thanks, Bill. Rayron from Milwaukee. Hi, good to see you again.
Hi, good morning. I'm so glad to see Pico Iyer here. I know you so well, even though I have not met you in person, because you and my teacher, Fulio Schrader, who was the abbess at San Francisco Zen Center, you have been having talks with her, and I'm sure, she told me very highly, she takes very highly of you. And I lived in monastic setting at Green Gulch and at Tassajara for 12 years, 3 years at Tassajara, and the Camaldoli brothers are our brothers. They are our neighbors there, and we also have an exchange program for monks who can also go to Esalen. We can visit those places also, and it feels very similar. And I just wanted to say, when you come as a guest to Camaldoli or any place, of course you can enjoy peace and freedom, but any of these places, including Benedictine monasteries, are very structured. They have the very similar structure to the Zen place. But of course, that's for the monks who live there, who are doing the practice out of compassion and love for the world. but also for themselves to really deeply wake up and also, you know, be in service. But we are also in service for the guests. So the summer in Sahara, you can come and you can just enjoy the whole place. You can go to the baths. You can do anything you want. And you know that, of course. Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you. You know, all of you are doing an incredible job of reading my mind, which is probably no coincidence because we're all part of the same mind. But I love it. Geoff was doing it, and now Ririn, you did it too. You mentioned exactly what I was about to say, because I have in my book the wonderful Fu Schrader, with whom I got to teach for many summers in Sahara, and I'm hoping maybe to write a book about her that would almost be the sequel to this, because I get so much from every sentence she delivers. And I have 2 pages in this book of just Fu talking. And my editor said, this is the highlight of the whole book. I mean, anyone who knows her knows that she speaks with precision and poetry and absolute directness. So thank you for mentioning that. And one of the most important things I hadn't mentioned before was exactly what you said, because quite often the monks allow me to stay with them in their enclosure, as they call it, when all the retreat rooms are full. And as soon as I'm on the other side of the wall, it's nothing but movement and commotion and very, very hard work. They're wearing blue work clothes, as you probably know. All I see are they're wheeling dirty clothes to the washing machine. They're cooking. They're settling the accounts. They're driving off to get the food to look after us. And I refer to it. I have a whole section in my book called "Into the Boiler Room," because just as you say, in order to sustain the luxurious sense of freedom and silence the retreatants enjoy, the monks are working around the clock. And I'm always very moved by the vow they make of obedience, because it's obedience not just to their God and not just to their prayer, but to one another. And in any monastic community, the monks or nuns are living with a lot of people whom in many cases they might never have chosen to live with for the rest of their lives. But there they are, every hour of their life. They've married 33 people, only 6 of whom perhaps they would have chosen. And so to be in service, looking after their fellow brothers as well as the guests, to me is a remarkable model of selflessness and of even tending to the people who may be the most difficult in your life. I remember Fu herself told me that in San Francisco Zen Center, when she began, she was suddenly told, cook for 150 people. And she'd meditated a lot, so she knew she could give Dharma talks. But just as you said so perfectly, I think in that tradition, you have to do everything, including all the things you aren't good at. And Fu told me how sometimes people come to that center and they've studied a lot of Buddhism and they've got an MA in it, and they're extremely wise about the precepts of Buddhism. So when they arrive, they're told, please go and clean the toilets. And that I love the fact that each one of us has an activity that'll probably is just what's necessary, because it's not going towards our strength, but right into our difficulties. Some of you may have seen the beautiful Japanese film Perfect Days that Wim Wenders made 2 years ago. And if you haven't, I think that's a little bit about all of this and how it's a very process of working and doing not so remarkable things that perhaps is where we can most show our devotion. But the perfect comment. Thank you, Erin.
Leslie Westbrook, you have your electronic hand up. Thank you so much.
Good morning, Geoff, and hello, Pico from Santa Barbara, California. Lovely to see you. I had a question about you mentioned the title from the Old Desert Fathers, AFLAME, and you said you can be on fire yourself.
Yes.
And I wonder if you might, maybe it's in the book, I haven't read it yet, but soon. I wonder if you might talk about that when you're on fire yourself, please. Thank you.
That Desert Father said it so well. I'm not sure I can improve upon it or clarify, but I suppose just this sense that action is a wonderful thing and devotion is a very wonderful thing, but maybe there's something beyond all that we find perhaps only in dramatic moments. I'm thinking of a mother who sees her child in the middle of the road, or another person's child in the middle of the road, and without thinking just races out to save that child. I mean, I think of that as being kind of on fire. In other words, responding to an intuition of real urgency, responding to the needs of the moment, and never giving up conviction and confidence, perhaps. I mean, I like the fact that, as in a koan, he's telling the younger monk to be all aflame doesn't make much literal or logical sense. So it's almost, to me, a way of going beyond logic, going beyond all the precepts that you have mastered to something that can't even be defined, but that is the ultimate. When we listen to the Dalai Lama, we're not just hearing somebody who's been studying Buddhism for 85 years and got his doctoral degree just before leaving last year in front of 10,000 wise monks. We're seeing something beyond definition and beyond explanation. And to me, being on fire is partly a metaphor for that. So maybe that's the best I can say. It's a really good question, but like the best questions, doesn't allow for much of an answer.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Leslie. Appreciate that. Friends, we have time. If any of you would like to put up your hand and make a comment. Jerry, thanks. Oh, there you are.
Sorry, I had the video off. Thank you, Pico. I'm in the process. I just started a couple of days ago listening to your book while driving AFLAME, and I appreciate it and hearing about your experiences. So thank you very much for being here. And I hesitate to bring this up because I know it's a flame for many of us as the events of yesterday, the inauguration, but I'm wondering if you might have any response to, I was thinking of your comments about surrender, and I'm not really quite comfortable with that approach, but I'm wondering what other thoughts you might have, or those kinds of thoughts about this new administration and how just uncomfortable so many of us are with it.
I honestly, although I've been in the mainstream media for 42 years, I try not to follow the news because I feel personally there's so much in the news that I can't really affect constructively. And there's so much in my immediate vicinity that I try to concentrate on my friends and neighbors rather than that which makes me feel powerless. But I just feel part of the reason I don't follow the news is, as I said, with the fire that took down my house, I find it impossible to tell whether any event is a good one or a bad one. Partly because I can't see the future and I don't see the larger picture and I don't know the long term in many ways. And so people would say that's a flimsy rationale for opting out. But everything comes and goes, and there are better answers I could give to your question than this. But I always remember how, for example, whenever I'm with the Dalai Lama and I ask him who are the most, he's had a front seat view on world affairs for 60 years. Who are the most impressive people that you've met? You've met all these leaders. Who are the most impressive? He always mentions two. Mao Zedong, who almost destroyed Tibet and would seem to be his worst enemy, and George W. Bush, who I think is his closest friend and most loyal supporter among major politicians and certainly among American presidents, and who shares his birthday and has been a very, very constant friend to him. And I remember when President Bush Jr. was in power, he did a lot of things I didn't love and I didn't approve of. And I'm afraid I didn't vote for him, and I was very taken by President Obama. But the Dalai Lama will tell you how George Bush radiated to him an honesty, a faithfulness, a loyalty, and a determination to look beyond the politics of the day that the Dalai Lama benefited from, and also helped Tibet in a way that others that I've appreciated, such as President Clinton and President Obama, couldn't. So I just feel I don't really know who those people are, and therefore I try and concentrate on the people that I'm in a better position to assess. My last book was based on the prejudice, perhaps, that in the age of information, we know less about the world than ever before because we get so much in secondhand. And so one reason why I spend a lot of my time going to Beirut and Jerusalem and Syria and North Korea and Iran and places in Cuba before is I don't trust what I'm getting at secondhand. I just want to encounter these realities firsthand and come away probably with more questions than answers. So most of the people who are in the public domain I've never met, and I don't feel I'm in a position to assess.
Thanks, Jerry. And Jerry, I think that's a very legitimate question. It's clearly on so many people's minds. So I appreciate you asked it. And maybe if we have time, we'll ask you what your approach is. My friend Ara Fitzgerald has her hand up. Thank you, Ara. Lovely to see you.
I think you might be on mute. I think Ara is
Unmute. Okay.
There you go. There you go.
Geoff, I can't. I'm on my phone because I couldn't get the sound on my computer. There's a question in chat that I wanted to ask for the person who had to leave, which I think you might find it. I don't think I can get back in there, but it was if words are flotsam and jetsam. I'm trying to remember this. What is your response about the process of what is writing for you?
Thank you. Thank you. Writing is an attempt to get beyond words, to get on the far side and beyond my thoughts. So, as I say, I'm a little embarrassed that I've never meditated. But if my wife were here, she would say all this guy does every day, forever, is just sit, 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 and try to find out what's on the far side of his projections and his thoughts and his illusions, and actually what he can't begin to put into words, and try to give an imperfect rendition of them to the world. And so I'm not very interested in what I send out into the world, but I am interested in that process of just sitting in silence by myself every day for the first 5 hours of each day to see what lies on the far side of my thoughts. I think working with words has made me much more distrustful of words than I would be otherwise. I choose to live in a country where I don't speak the language, and I choose to live with a partner whose English is quite limited, but my Japanese is more limited, and we've been together for 37 years. And I feel that if you're with somebody you know well, the best thing you can share is silence, because words can so often be weapons and smoke screens and shields and many other things. So, I could talk about fingers pointing at the moon and many other things, but it's really what we can't express that is most interesting to me and that I find most rewarding to think about. And some of you may have heard, Bill, I think, kindly mentioned that I did a talk with Terry Gross last week, and I don't know what she included on that talk because we talked for a very, very long time. But I did mention how when I would visit Leonard Cohen in his little house in a very unfashionable part of Los Angeles, and he was the most articulate writer I've ever met. And so we would have lunch. The first time, for example, we had lunch, he spoke spellbindingly about the life of the spirit and literature and Zen practice and his life in Cuba and Greece and everything else. And then at the end of the lunch, he took 2 folding chairs and he brought them out to his tiny garden on his quiet residential street in Los Angeles, looking at his small bed of flowers. And I sat next to him, and he sat down, and nothing. And more nothing, and more nothing. And after many minutes, I thought, well, this is a gentle hint. So I said, oh, yeah, I should leave you because you must be busy. And he looked at me, please, don't go. And so he had realized, though he was as eloquent as anyone I will meet, that the deepest form of kinship and fellowship and friendship was sharing silence. And many people would go to his house and then just sit there in silence. And of course, the name that he was given by his Japanese teacher was Jikan, the silence between 2 thoughts. And his teacher would always say, as soon as we speak, we're going to be arguing, so let's not speak. So to answer that question precisely, one of the beautiful things I've found staying at the monastery is that when I talk to the monks, they speak in complete sentences and they say very little, maybe 2 sentences. And those sentences stay with me for a long, long, long time, certainly for as long as I'm staying there, in a way that 2 paragraphs wouldn't, because I can tell the silence that lies between those and beneath those words. And it's as if each word is a polished stone that's been brought up from a very deep place. When I walk along the monastery road, I'll often pass a fellow retreatant. And again, maybe we'll exchange a couple of sentences. And those sentences just reverberate through me because I can feel the silence around and behind them. So as a writer, I'm mostly, in this book, trying to fill the pages with silence. And the older I get, the more I try to keep words out of it entirely and to make it a little bit like a haiku. I mean, I see this book as a series of haiku. And one thing I love about the haiku is that it's deeply personal, but it's not smudged by personality. The typical haiku will say, dusk is falling, the birds are flying home, the boat struggles against its tether. So it's all external observation, but you can feel the feeling behind it, and you're joined together in really a place beyond words, because a haiku is an emblem of impermanence. It's gone almost as soon as it begins, because it's only 17 syllables. And so I think in a book like this, I'm just trying to invite the reader into the silence that I've found so liberating. And so what I do in a case like this is work very, 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 very hard to write extremely slowly, to try to bring the reader into a state of calm and clarity, regardless of the words, the page, and to keep most of the words out. Because I've been there more than 100 times for 33 years, I have maybe 4,000 pages of notes. And one of the interesting challenges in this book was to distill 4,000 pages of notes into relatively few pages, so that really it would be the silence that reverberates through. Geoff very kindly mentioned the book I wrote, my first book 37 years ago, Video Night in Kathmandu, and that's all clamor and clatter. Every page is me shouting at the reader nonstop for 370 pages. So it could be entertaining perhaps, but it's pretty deafening. And I feel as the world has grown so deafening, and the external world is so in danger of crowding out the inner landscape, that as a writer, I'm trying to claim those pockets of silence that can exist in spite of the clamor of the world. So I can't compete with the noisiness of the world, but what I can offer is non-noisiness, silence.
Thank you.
Did that get to it, Ara? Was that good?
I think so. I think it was someone named Tim had left that question in the chat, and I just thought it was a marvelous question. And Pico, thank you for that extraordinary answer. I take away from it that words are kind of, I don't know, the seashells to silence or something, that let us listen to the science, to the
Beautiful.
silence. Yeah.
And actually, in that little section I read, to kind of set a tone for this, I did have the Roshi saying, words are needless scratches on the clarity of what lies beyond. So getting us to that place that
right.
we have to use words, but we also have to appreciate how fragile they are.
Yes.
I was just noticing a quote from Pascal, who's a great source of wisdom for me, who says, part of the function of reason is to appreciate and cherish everything that lies beyond reason. And probably you could say the same about speech. I think, Thoreau, who's an abiding hero of mine, said speech is for the hard of hearing. I like that too. But seashells is a pretty beautiful way to put it too. Thank you very much for that.
You're most welcome.
Thanks, Laura. And Pico, I'm so glad you mentioned that about your current book. I was thinking about that as I was finishing it, is that, and I perhaps you'd get this audio, I'm not so sure, but there's a lot of space there. I mean, even physically on the page, there are, little 1 line or 2 lines or 3 lines and then space, and then another little couplet and then space, and I thought it was just me, but I experienced those as exhalations. they just made reading the book lovely that way. So thank you for pointing that out. Friends, we have a little bit of time. If there's another comment, a short one. I might have one last question. Rerin, if you'd like to go again.
Okay, I just wanted to mention, I just wrote it in the chat, that Katagiri Roshi's first book is called Returning to Silence, and the second one is called You Have to Say Something. So I have both, and they're both talks, his talks, but the first is Returning to Silence, and then You Have to Say Something. So both, thank you.
Perfect. So when I was 29 and I was leading a very exciting life in New York City, and I threw it over in the hope of going to spend a year in a Zen temple in Kyoto. And I didn't last the year because I had a lot of romantic notions of what a Zen temple would be, which all of you have worked through. But I came to know a wonderful Zen teacher, and he said a variation of what Rerin just said, because he said, well, remember that the whole point of this practice is not in the going away from the world, it's in the coming back. And, I quickly in Kyoto learned that Zen saying that it's relatively easy to be silent in a meditation hall. How are you silent in the middle of Times Square? And how do you bring that degree of attention to a very, very crowded life? So I'm very happy to hear the second part of that too, which is just a reminder that silence is a means not just to clear a speech, but maybe to action. And stepping away from the world is only so you can step much deeper into it with a stronger sense of direction and maybe a lesser sense of self. But and thank you also, Geoff, for what you were saying about the book. It's meant to be a series of parables, and I deliberately keep time and date and chronology out of it so that you're in that space that is not confined by those particulars. I mean, the Greeks, as you probably know, speak of chronos, which is calendar time, and kairos, which is sacred time. One of the trailers where the Benedictine monks make available to visitors is actually called kairos. And so the notion is you take your watch off when you go there. I do, at least. You're stepping out of the calendar and you're into some much more spacious landscape. And that was the landscape I was trying to bring into the page as much as I could.
I think you succeeded. Yes, good. This is a question, maybe we end here, but it could be a long answer as well. Are you hopeful? And if so, where does that come from?
I'm very hopeful. I'm very hopeful. And it would be a long answer, and I apologize because I've given too many long answers already. I do feel, I sort of intimated it earlier in this conversation, that the world our country has advanced amazingly since I was young. When I think of the rights that are afforded to minority groups, to women, to LGBT community, to all kinds of people, when I was growing up, going to college in the 1970s, I never expected we would get as far as we have now. I never expected that we would have a half-black president already in the White House. In all those ways, as I say, it's so easy to notice the things that are going wrong. And of course, many people are rightly worried that a lot of that's going to be dialed back and reversed now. But for the moment, I think we've made great progress. Zoom technology is another example. I think many of us are living longer lives and often healthier lives than I could have imagined when I was young. My mother passed away recently at 90. And if you told me when I was in college, you'll have a parent who lives to the age of 90, I would say, not possible. That's too much to dream of. And here it is. And now so quickly we take it for granted and we think of somebody in 91 as relatively young. The world is so much more global and diverse. When I went to high school in England, there were 1,250 boys. 3 of us had dark skins. I go to that same school now, and it seems as if every other person is from Korea and India and Russia, and a mingling of all of them. And I think in those ways too, so many of the hard and fast black and white divisions of the world are being dissolved very quickly. Whenever I once in 43 years, I went into a class to teach for 3 months, and I couldn't believe how bright, responsible, efficient, kind, and talented the students were, and how instantly global they were. In other words, they really, I think of Cape Town and Prague and Cambodia as part of our neighborhood as much their concern as Newark, New Jersey. Nobody was thinking like that when I was growing up. And so I'm very hopeful with the way the world has gone. There are many causes for concern now, among them, of course, the climate crisis and the fires we've been thinking of, the warfare that we see everywhere, the injustice that still exists. But I think as long as I've been alive, people have been worried about the end of the world, whether it was Y2K or nuclear war with the Soviets in the 1980s or all kinds of, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And when I was a little boy, there's always going to be a cause for concern. But I don't think that needs challenge our sense of hope. And I think it's partly, for me, it's by trying not to concentrate on the moment, but to see the larger picture. Whenever, because I spend a lot of time with the Dalai Lama, and because I see so many people come to him with real concerns, public and private, and they always ask him, Your Holiness, what can we do? And he always says, please take a wider perspective, meaning in time and space, see the whole picture. And I think a wider perspective is a wiser perspective. And I know we're coming up to 1:30 when we should end. So I'll just say, I was having breakfast with somebody I only met once 31 years ago, but he took me out for breakfast here in Pittsburgh today. And he said, gosh, that everyone in the US is in such a downcast state at the moment. And I said, yeah, I know. I really feel for my compatriots here. But, I spend a lot of my time in India and China, where people are so much more optimistic than they were 30 years ago. And so many of the countries I visit, for all the problems that remain, feel that their lives are infinitely better than they used to be and are moving forwards very rapidly. So I think the global perspective for me has helped free me from thinking of my local problems and seeing how many in the world have causes for rejoicing.
Wonderful, beautiful way to wrap this up, Pico. And I do want to add, with everything that has improved and changed over time, the In-N-Out burger menu has stayed just exactly the same.
And the prices too, exactly. I realize in a world of impermanence, we have it to hold on to. Exactly. My wife and I eat big meals, the two of us, $8, and really good service too. And the genius of In-N-Out is, as you said, they have the same menu, and it's a very simple menu, but to the savants, there are all kinds of things off the menu you can order. So actually, there's a lot of choice, but it's founded on simplicity. Thank you, Geoff. That's the most important thing to take away, as it were.
Well, let us not have this be the last time we get together, especially if you follow AFLAME with a book on Fu Schrader. That would be so much fun to have you talk about her. So consider that you have a standing invitation to return, and we'll do this again. And before we go, I started this way too. But if you haven't read Pico, or if you've only read one of his books, dig in. There's 15 of them there, and it's rich and varied and beautiful. And it's really, his books are really a part of my life and my shelf back there. So I invite you to join in. My new friend Pico, thank you so much. I so appreciate your time and you sharing your heart and your wisdom, your perspective and your stories. I wish we had more time. And thank you all for staying with us. And we'll end here.
And I'll just say thank you truly, Geoff, for all your kind comments, for inviting me to this community. And thank you to everybody here for all that you do. I know you're doing a lot for the world in a time of need. So thank you.